Good evening. I'm Jeff Cowan, the Dean of the Annenberg School, and I want to welcome you all to what I think will be a wonderful discussion this evening. I was looking forward to introducing the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, Catherine O'Neill, but I'm going to have to rely on her husband to tell her that she was so introduced, because the real reason that we always love to have Richard Reeves at this school is that his wife is the secret behind the other throne, and that is Kofi Annan's representative in Washington, D.C. And many of you remember Catherine O'Neill from her years in Los Angeles in so many roles, but she left a few minutes ago. She was at our reception earlier, and Richard, I hope you'll tell her how much we enjoyed seeing her, and sorry that she's not.
I enjoy seeing her too whenever I do.
I know it, right. I have one of those arrangements as well.
Right.
Our speaker this evening, I am proud to say, is billed in his press releases as a visiting professor of journalism at the Annenberg School for Communications at USC, at our school, which is another neat trick since he spends almost all of his time on the East Coast. But we still claim him because he is a wonderful teacher and has been a part of this community, and we very much hope that he will come back to be a part of it again. Richard Reeves has written a dozen books, many of them presidential biographies, and though he's known as a presidential biographer, and that no doubt will occupy most of our time tonight, I know that on your book tour, Dick, a lot of people have wanted to talk to you about Afghanistan because there aren't that many people who have written books about Afghanistan. But Richard, being very prescient, has one of those too. And I think one of the things to be fun is that after his talk this evening, his interlocutor will be Michael Parks, the director of the journalism school here, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was reporter from many parts of the world, and won his Pulitzer for his reporting from South Africa, but also has had at least 20 different visits to Afghanistan. So between the two of them, I think they know more about that country than most people who are in this community. I just want to read you a couple of nice comments about Richard Reeves' wonderful book, which I'm reading, about President Nixon. One of them, is Tom Friedman a friend of yours? This is the kind of thing everybody dreams of. Tom Friedman's column the other day starts with the following statement. He said, "I happened to be reading Richard Reeves' compelling new biography of Richard Nixon last week." Doesn't everybody want that kind of an opening of a Tom Friedman column? So Tom Friedman calls it compelling. Richard, of course, used to be the chief political correspondent for the New York Times, so he sort of has that particular form locked up. And so the actual book review in the New York Times talked about this as an engrossing book, a wonderful book review. And then in another article about Richard in the New York Times, and no doubt there are more to come, the book is called, it says it's hard to think of a better introduction to the man and the presidency than this book by Richard Reeves. The only review that I have in front of me that was not written for the New York Times was written for the Baltimore Sun, and so some of you may think that suggests that at last we are through with nepotism, but in fact the writer for the Baltimore Sun is none other than our own dear faculty member Ed Guthman. More about that no doubt later. Richard, it is wonderful to have you back here and to have you have a chance to talk with us about this wonderful book, and then later for a Q&A that Michael Parks will discuss. Richard Reeves.
Thanks. Thanks. It is great to be here. It's like being home. However, I do want to deconstruct the Guthman review of the book. It has some great stuff about Ed Guthman, who after all was number 3 on Nixon's enemies list. It has a touch or two on me, and then it ends by saying, this is the big point he makes in the review, at the end, Reeves includes a bibliographic essay by one of his University of Southern California students, Jonathan Cassidy, listing many of the hundreds of books about Nixon and describing the status of Nixon's tape in White House documents, where they were, etc. It's a valuable, incredible survey underscoring the depth of Reeves' 7 years of research and his skill in writing a most readable account, etc., etc. And my researcher indeed was a student of of mine here named Jonathan Cassidy, who has moved on to become a reporter at the Hill, the Capitol Hill newspaper. But I would like to say for the record, I wrote this book, not Cassidy. I also get, in my line of work, though no one's ever accused me of being one, get to meet a lot of Republicans, at least on this book. And this is a note from one of them. I read President Nixon, although I must admit I immediately went to the index to see what they said about me, and luckily they didn't lay a glove on me, except that is for Henry Kissinger calling me an idiot. Sincerely, George H.W. Bush. I'll talk tonight, if I may, and if we can expand it later, about Nixon and the press. One of the great stories over time, but about how he saw us, and to a certain extent about how we saw him, how he changed us, how we changed or perhaps got from him. This book is kind of, to me at least, a bookend with the book that I did on John F. Kennedy, both of them trying to analyze the presidency in terms of what the president knew and when he knew it, each day during critical moments. And I did that because I had read enough of academic history and eyewitness history of presidencies to know that they seem to fall into two categories. One being issue themes, Vietnam, the economy, the Soviet Union, etc. Others being based on a thesis about who the person was, often Freudian. And I knew from my own days of covering the White House, and I had first covered, though I had never met John Kennedy, I was in school, I did know Richard Nixon and met him first as a young reporter in 1965, and then covered him in the White House, and later spent time with him in the 80s when I think he saw us as just a couple of writers shooting the bull, and he was quite different that time. But the method, and I don't think it's an accident, that you can only judge, I think, what the presidency is like by dealing with it chronologically and understanding what the president was working on at any different times, and also they were that's the way it is. It's not this clear, organized thinking thing that historians have done, and I think it is because of chronology and a certain narrative power that journalists, in fact, are prevailing in writing the serious history of recent times. The David McCulloughs, David Halberstams, Neil Sheehan's, Taylor Branches of the world are far more instructive than most of the work coming out of the Academy. Like them, I tend to get pretty good reviews, but when I get a bad one, I know it's from an associate professor of something who said, well, you know, we've known these things all along. But I do think journalists are prevailing, and it is a lesson for all of us and for students that our trade has expanded far beyond telling people what, when, and where today. And we have attracted the kind of people I just talked about, terrific people over my lifetime. When I want to talk, because of what we do, a little bit more than I would usually about the sourcing of things. I worked each day on this book as I had on the Kennedy book, although the Nixon book is the best documented, Nixon presidency is the best documented presidency there's ever been and probably will be, partially because the FBI seized the good stuff before it went out of the White House, as it had usually done in the past. But I would kind of sit in my own little world with a Xerox of the front page of that day's New York Times, the entries in Haldeman's diary, which I was able to expand because I found the parts of the diaries which had been removed for national security and personal reasons, and then the president's daily news summary. Each day Nixon would get a news summary prepared by a staff headed by Pat Buchanan, which would list the events of the day. Things like when he first saw and he would annotate everything, thank God. When he first saw in the news summary that there were people in Congress talking about making a national holiday of Martin Luther King's birthday, his response to that, written in letters twice as large as normal, no, never. That would be like making Nero Christ. So you've got that kind of input, and you've also got that sense, which I came to conclude is critical to understanding how both the presidency and our politics work. And that is, it's such a goldmine comparing what a president has on his desk and what was in the press that day, because it is quite different. The people did not know what Richard Nixon was doing always. Hell, he didn't know what he was doing himself a lot of times. But this was an extraordinary president. Among his idols was Charles de Gaulle, and the most extraordinary thing about his president, other than with his personality and his introversion, that he got the job in a business where generally run by people who can't stand to be alone. He, through a triumph of will and great intelligence, was able to rise as a man who didn't like people at all and didn't want them around. It was almost as if he set out to be a star in the NBA. But the sourcing was so heavy about that White House that partly because H.R. Haldeman, Bob Haldeman, as chief of staff, was kind of a pre-computer organizational genius, so that anyone who met with the president, a number that became smaller as time went on, had to file within 48 hours a report on what had happened. So you had this Rashomon effect. Beyond that, the president, who always felt that people never appreciated his great warmth and humor, had created a corps called the Anecdotalists. Very talented people, Bill Sapphire, Ray Price, Pat Buchanan, who would stay in the corner of meetings and write down the little jokes and warmth that Nixon wanted passed out to columns. It wasn't tough duty for most of them to do that. They could relax a bit. And the research that then did a great deal for me had to do with a couple of things. The most important of them, really, that because of the circumstances that Nixon left the presidency, the presidency was taken out of the building. Our presidents come into empty buildings. It's a kind of sense of the world made new that the Americans have always liked. And so that at midnight, the day before he left, Rosemary Woods and two of her assistants emptied his desks. His desks were still full, and put them in boxes, which ended up in the National Archives in Maryland and were unopened for decades. And they were the most important dialogues in the White House, the internal dialogues of an introvert, of a man who could not understand social cues, a man who had created himself by watching other people to learn how to behave in social situations. And those yellow pages from yellow pads, which he would write at all day and all night because he was alone most of the time, show the man he wanted to be, and as you go through them, begin to show, almost novelistically, the man he actually was, and finally the man he became. But the first of those notes, begun a second day in the White House, were like New Year's resolutions. And no one saw them but himself. Compassionate, bold, new, courageous, a zest for the job. I'll open channels for dissent. On the press, the intellectual establishment, the partisan Democrats are hopelessly against, but I must find a better way to go over them to the people. Third, above all, don't let them break through and see what kind of man the new Nixon is. Maintain the mystery. The mystery, White Houses usually being extensions of one man, The mystery was central to some of the most extraordinary governing in the history of our democracy. Nixon, like his idol Charles de Gaulle, wanted to govern by surprise. And he did govern by surprise. He came on television one night and said that he was going to China, and that this was a move that would change the politics and military balance of the world, and indeed it did. There had not been a moment of public debate about that. It was a total surprise to the nation when Nixon appeared and said that. Later, when Nixon appeared, came on television after a weekend in Camp David and announced that the United States was going to impose wage and price controls, but more importantly was unlinking the dollar from gold, that there was going to be a totally new economic monetary system in the world with free-floating exchange rates, which led to the globalization of today. There had been no debate whatever on that. He simply got on television and said it. He had, as he said he wanted to do, gone around not only to Congress, not only the press, but the American people to do what it was he thought should be done. His presidency, where with a Clinton or a Kennedy, people who live life as a race against boredom, people who can't stand to be alone, would favor a kind of spoke and hub, like wagon wheel organization, where the president was at the center and then the spokes led to one assistant or another. McGeorge Bundy did not really know what was the president was saying along another line to say Robert McNamara, because Nixon's goal, Kennedy's goal, was to be the center of action and to control his people in that way. Nixon's presidency turned out to be an exercise in keeping people away. One of the first things I came upon and had great influence on me was that when he was vice president, Nixon was in the hospital for a couple of days at Walter Reed. I've forgotten what for, and President Eisenhower went out to meet him, to see him. And when Eisenhower came back, he stopped by the desk of his secretary, a woman named Ann Whitman, and said, I can't understand it. Dick doesn't seem to have any friends. Ann Whitman kept her own counsel, but that night in her diary wrote, the president doesn't understand that the vice president is not a nice man. He's a man trying to learn how to pretend to be a nice man. He's learning by watching other people. And she was quite correct in that. And one of the ways he dealt with that, one of the ways he was able to rise in this business, was that he had a tremendous gift for memorization and memorized almost everything that he said in public and much of what he said in private, because one-on-one encounters were extremely difficult for him to deal with, so that when he met with Pearl Bailey, as an example, the singer, he had an 8-page script of what she would say, of what he would say, and it was what got him through situations like that. He'd look out the window, as he does on the cover of the book, and say, God, this would be a great job if you didn't have to deal with people. On the 27th day of his presidency, James Keogh, former editor of Time magazine, who was a press assistant in the White House, wrote a memo to Nixon. Almost all communication with Nixon was on paper, which made it easier for me. Wrote that media treatment of the president is almost uniformly excellent. The usual media characterizations are efficient, cool, confident, orderly. Nixon wrote on the bottom of that, had it sent back as, you don't understand, these people are waiting to destroy us. And to a certain extent that was true. Alan Drury, the novelist, in fact a former New York Times reporter, had went to one of the press conferences later on in the 70s and said that as the announcement was made, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, and everyone stood, that what he heard, including a voice behind him, was, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, unfortunately, from a reporter standing behind him. That week, the Pulitzers were announced for 1971. One was for the Pentagon Papers, the New York Times for the Pentagon Papers, and the other major award was Jack Anderson for columns on the secret tilt toward Pakistan in the 1970 war between East and West Pakistan and then India, which ended in the creation of Bangladesh. John Osborne of the New Republic, who wrote a weekly column on the presidency in the New Republic, and at least as I went through the journalism of the time, was probably the most perceptive reporter writing on Nixon. Wrote at one point, the most difficult thing about covering Nixon is remembering that this is a human being. And to a certain extent, Nixon believed that himself. He was, in that period, inspecting some new law enforcement material, including some sort of little heat-seeking device to find people who were hiding, for immigrants, illegal immigrants, or drug people or whatnot. And when he walked by the machine, it did its thing, and it went click, 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 like this. And Nixon turned to the assembled and said, "You see, I am a human being." He was, ironically, he was a man very open to criticism, as long as it was not face-to-face and as long as it was on paper. And one of his younger assistants, not many presidents could do this. Younger assistants, a man named Doug Hallett, wrote a memo on how the president was perceived by the public, and he said, "We've got to stop displaying the president as if he had a stick up his ass. Put him in gutsy, colorful, photographic situations with people." Nixon wrote across that, "He's right, he's right." He, again, one of his forays against the press was the unleashing of Spiro Agnew. Everything that Agnew said was edited first by Nixon, and in one case, after Nixon's November 3rd, 1969 speech on Vietnam, and he was dissatisfied that the press did not say, "This is a wonderful document and a wonderful president," and thus began the kind of cultural warfare that Nixon gloried in. Nixon loved to divide people into kind of tribal groupings to manipulate them politically. But the key line of that speech, which was actually of Agnew's speech, which was actually written by Nixon, was a small group of men numbering perhaps no more than a dozen anchormen, commentators, and executive producers settle upon the film and commentary that is to reach the public. They decide what 40 or 50 million Americans will learn of the day's events and in the world. In January 1970, after that, the Wall Street Journal, then in the process of becoming the first national newspaper, took up the Agnew fight over what Nixon, who was an angry conservative populist, thought was the establishment. And one of those editorials began, "The heart of the Agnew phenomenon is precisely the class has sprung up in this nation that it considers itself uniquely qualified, the thinking people, and is quite willing to dismiss ordinary Americans with utter contempt, the rednecks." Nixon's comment on that when he saw it in his news summary was excellent, very perceptive, and he had that editorial, which was about this long, distributed to everyone in the administration. It ended with, "Whose theology culminates in the death of God? Whose artistic advice culminates in pornography? Whose moral advice culminates in anything goes with sex and drugs? Whose children sacked the universities?" Nixon tried to hire the writer of that editorial, saying in a memo that he was sure they paid him he was very young, and paid him very little. The writer turned down the job, but became one of the most influential men in the country, certainly during my lifetime. His name was Bob Bartley, and he was 27 then, and had just retired as the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and became one of the leading, most influential and powerful voices of the conservative revival that followed all the way through Reagan, the Bushes. Nixon was a real cultural warrior. He really didn't like these people. He wanted to, when he heard that there was a nude scene in Hair on Broadway, he was extremely upset by that, and he had this plan. For those of us old enough to remember it, it was the flag floating. It was like a strobe shot. You really couldn't tell what was happening. But he wanted to go to the play when that scene happened with his entourage, stand up in the front seat and stalk out of the theater. He also did walk out of the film West Side Story, pretty bland stuff, saying, "I can't stand all this race-mixing propaganda." Many of us, whatever our race is, were certainly willing to mix with Natalie Wood. Nixon liked three things as far as I could tell. Relaxed with only three things. One was sports, which he knew a good deal about. Two was getting even, which is what he was about. And three was campaign management. He was more Machiavelli than the Prince and loved to sit for long hours planning other people's campaigns. If he had his way, he would have managed both his own campaigns and his opponents too, and enjoyed it equally to do it. On the sports thing, he rarely watched television, but one day a ball game was rained out that he wanted to watch, so he flipped the dial, the surfing of its time, and he came upon a show and immediately whipped out his yellow pad with a note for Haldeman, which read, "Star of show square type named Archie, hippie son-in-law. This show is a total glorification of homosexuality. They always make Archie look bad and the homos look good. Is this common on television? Are the homos destroying our society? Who is this Archie Bunker?" On children, after the young people, after demonstrations reached the street, particularly after Cambodia, his comment was on the kid thing, "We got to be stronger against bomb throwing. Let others say life is hard for the little bastards and that we should listen to them." Why would we listen to them? And it went both ways to a certain extent, particularly with the press. Nixon hated to hold press conferences, but not, I think, for the reasons that we think he did, because he did relatively well in press conferences, but because before each press conference he would memorize every conceivable answer, usually in the 200 questions that had been staffed out, but that he would then edit and memorize and go out and do his 45 minutes. Take him a couple days to do that. He would then, he had a great gift for memorization. Len Garment thought that he had learned it because as a very young boy, he had learned to play hundreds of songs on the piano without being able to read a note of music, literally by figuring out what to do. But he said that, Len Garment said, you just could not believe how quickly he could memorize word for word large stacks of paper. And then the kind of intense effort, physical effort of the press conference, and then it would take him 2 or 3 days, usually go to Camp David, to come down from this emotional peak. So that for him, a press conference was not 45 minutes on television. It was a week of this intense up and down emotion ripping him to pieces. And we played our part too. It was a time where correspondents like Stu Lurie and Jules Witkover, both then of the Los Angeles Times, tried to organize reporters to make the questioning more rational, to use lines of questioning against the president. And of course, this president knew as much about leaking as anyone ever did. He had made his career by leaking information, particularly when he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee and during the Hiss investigation. He really was a skilled user of the press when he could bring himself to actually deal with them. But within his own government, he destroyed himself eventually trying to stop leaks, which, as most of us know, can't be stopped. He wanted to use what he called the German option to deal with leakers. When a leak came out of a department, this is one of the things he wrote by himself late at night. We will give them 24 hours for one of them to come up and say that he leaked the letter. If they don't, then we ask for the resignation of all 6. This is the battle plan. This is what the Germans did. Execute it. It didn't work, but leaks attacked the very government that he constructed. And the government based on surprise, but surprise depends on secrecy. Secrecy depends on lying. And when you get to the point, and this was a house of lies, it came to a point where no one knew what the truth was anymore. And at that point, everyone began to spy on each other. And they thought they were doing it in the national interest. It was not only that Nixon or the FBI were wiretapping people. The Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, was wiretapping the presidency. The Joint Chiefs of Staff would send people in to collect the garbage at the White House every night and bring it over to the Pentagon to try to figure out what Nixon and Kissinger were doing. Then the Joint Chiefs also installed a stenographer in Kissinger's office, who each night when Kissinger went to dinner would photograph the papers in his briefcase and deliver them to Admiral Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And these people felt they were doing that in the national interest. They felt that they could not do their jobs because they could not find out what was secretly happening in the White House at that time. It was also the period where one of Nixon's ideas, his ideas were often ignored, partly because people did not believe him, but on the other hand, he had to know this was going on. In September of 1970, 5 planes headed for New York were hijacked by Palestinians who landed them on an abandoned old British airfield in Jordan and threatened to kill the 800 people on board, obviously many of the Americans, because the planes were headed for America, if Palestinian prisoners were not released around the world. Nixon immediately ordered airstrikes on Palestinian targets in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Before the word got to the Pentagon, the Army Signal Corps, which was tapping the White House's phones, informed Laird that this order was coming. Laird's reaction to that was to pick up the phone and call Admiral Moore and tell him there'll be bad weather in the Gulf for the next 2 weeks, next 2 days. No planes can fly. And no planes indeed did fly, though the president had ordered them. And the situation resolved itself when the Jordanian army, King Hussein's army, began to defeat the Palestinian guerrillas in what came to be called Black September. The worst moment for Nixon in reading his news summaries came when the news summary reported that 80 of 89 National Football League players, people he adored, planned to vote for McGovern. Nixon couldn't work for about an hour after he read that, and he finally sent people out to find out whether they were black. It must be the blacks, he wrote across the thing. On the other hand, how did we do? Not so very well at times. On the day of his second inauguration, January 20th, 1973, the Washington Post did a 22-page section called The Nixon Years. Watergate was never mentioned in those 22 pages. 6 days later, there was a press conference, the first of the new administration. There were 22 questions. None of them were about Watergate. But in fact, people did have a sense that something very strange was going on there. And in one of the last magazine's last editorials published in one of the last issues of Life magazine, there was an editorial which came very close to what was happening in the White House that said, the Nixon administration has remained a small junta, suspicious of the bureaucrats it presides over, ill at ease with Congress, distrustful of those it can't control, at once defensive and sometimes outright arrogant in behavior. It is unnecessarily inhospitable to people whose ideas might occasionally help it. The junta's deep sense of being surrounded by enemies has permeated the Washington atmosphere. And that was quite true. At that time, on March 4th of 1973, the New York Times began a wonderfully perceptive four-part series on changes in government under Nixon, which quite caught what was on Nixon's mind. And the first piece by a reporter named John Herbers, under the headline, Nixon's Presidency, Expansion of Power, Scholars See a Major Impact. We still, anybody who had a title before or after their name could be quoted as an expert. Scholars see a major impact on government's operation. And the lead began, Richard M. Nixon and what he achieved in his first term and what he had undertaken in the second is attempting an expansion in presidential powers that could have more impact on the national government than that of any other president since Franklin D. Roosevelt. That is the opinion of historians, political scientists, and other students of the presidency interviewed during recent weeks. That was quite true. Nixon was a man of great accomplishment with a wonderful architectural mind. He could see the world whole. He knew how things were connected, and he stood on the edge of greatness. He had an extraordinary run of achievements. He was indeed the architect of his times. He remade the world politically and economically with not only the opening to China, but with a strategy which Kissinger described as being quite simple. That was that we were always for the weaker. We were for China against the Soviet Union. We were for Pakistan against India, to try to retain regional balance and not have those people export their problems in our direction, a story that resonates still. He restored order in the country, which is what he was elected to do. After all, the country was at war with itself in 1968, and by a combination of being tough, of giving the impression that people were going to be shot, and some were, but mostly by initiating first the draft lottery and then ending the draft. He did quiet down the streets of the country, except during the invasion of Cambodia. He completed, quite brilliantly, the desegregation of schools in the South. Fewer than 10% of those schools were desegregated when he took office, and more than 95% were when he left. Nixon was a national politician. The Southern strategy, I think, was wildly overrated by the press. The way he desegregated the schools, by the way, and the way he was comfortable with it, he didn't care one way or the other. His description for democratic government for domestic problems was first that he didn't think the country needed a domestic president, and second, I didn't come here to build outhouses in Peoria. Other presidents felt pretty much that way too, but he was able to deal with the desegregation by pushing it more and more toward the courts when he realized it was inevitable and did not take the heat for it. At the same time, he was trying to build a political movement, even a new party, based on combining conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans and leaving the right wing of the Republican Party and the left wing of the Democratic Party off the charts, as it were. And the way to do that had everything to do with George Wallace. Nixon had been elected with 43% of the vote in 1968, and George Wallace had gotten 16% of the vote. Nixon wanted that 60%, and the way to get it was to prevent Wallace from running as an independent and either have him not run or run within the Democratic Party and raise hell. Well, as we know, he did run in the Democratic Party that year, much of his campaign financed by the White House, as they had financed his principal opponent in Wallace's principal opponent after Wallace was prevented from serving as governor of Alabama by term limits and then campaigned for his wife, Lurleen, who then died in office, and Albert Brewer, the lieutenant governor, was running and had a damn good chance to beat Wallace, and that chance was enhanced by the fact that Nixon delivered $400,000 in cash to the Brewer campaign, later delivered hundreds of thousands to Wallace's campaign to keep him alive. The money was transferred in the lobby of the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York, and a man would sit there with a briefcase on his lap, and another man would come up to him and say, are you Mr. Jensen from Detroit? And the man with the bag would say, no, I am Mr. Jensen from Baltimore. The man was Herbert Kalmbach, the president's personal lawyer, and he would hand the money over, and one of the couriers was a former Alabama reporter named Jim Bob Solomon, who was terrified about carrying all of this money in sequential $100 bills, so that each time he carried it, he would write a note saying, my name is Jim Bob Solomon, and give his address, and say, this is not my money, I am carrying it for the President of the United States. And he would pin that note to his underwear, so that if there were a plane crash, the note would be found. In fact, part of the unraveling of Watergate did come about because of a plane crash when E. Howard Hunt's wife died in a plane crash on a United flight from Washington to Chicago, and in her handbag were $100 bills, sequentially, which was hush money to go to the men who were arrested in Watergate. And in the end, I don't want to give the impression that Nixon was without nuance. He was a strangely wired fellow who had a view of the world based on what most of us do. That is that we mirror image ourselves and try to wonder what other people's motives are, et cetera, and whatnot. And Nixon thought other people were like him, but of course they weren't. And he did have his doubts, both about policy and obviously great about himself, including some of these memos that he would write late at night to himself, and that would end up in the desk drawer, were things like this in October of 1972. Is it possible we were wrong from the start in Vietnam? Have we misjudged the Viet Cong from the beginning, that we could run them to the wire and exhaust them, that we could stop dissent in the United States and then they would talk, that we would hit them hard enough and jolt them and they would talk and quit? Well, of course, we tried all those things and they didn't work, and Nixon, above all, knew that they didn't. Finally, in his when the White House had turned itself into this place of deception, he began to hire detectives. They were originally hired to put a 24-hour-a-day tail on Ted Kennedy. He was obsessed by the Kennedys. With all of his world travels, the place he spent the least time in, and one of the most important places in the world, was Berlin, where he went once and left within a half hour because Berlin's a Kennedy city. He would not allow the Battle Hymn of the Republic to be played. The Battle Hymn of the Republic's a Kennedy song. In 1971, in the end of the year Gallup poll for the most admired men in America, John F. Kennedy, who was dead, had 34%. Martin Luther King, who was dead, had 19%. Robert Kennedy, who was dead, had 15%. Richard Nixon, who was alive and was president, had 6%. And so that those things stuck with him throughout his presidency. Finally, when Nixon rarely spent more than 3 or 4 nights under the same roof. He would move from place to place, and often when he moved to Camp David, he would essentially plot coups against his own government. And finally, he got the chance to do that on a formal basis to create what would have amounted to a new system of government. When he went after the 1972 election, the greatest landslide in history, he called in his cabinet and took their resignations. He called in his staff and took all their resignations. Then went to Camp David to put together a new administration where Haldeman and Ehrlichman would screen people, and he moved people around, he let people go, he brought new people in, but all of the new members of the staff and cabinet had to sign a contract with 15 clauses. No one, of course, knew about this. The clauses, 3 of the clauses were these. 1, the essence of the new organization is the concept that secretaries and counselors to the president are the president's men and not the creatures of their departments, not the department's advocate to the president. 2, no policy-making power resides in any policy council, policy group, assistant to the president, counselor to the president, or cabinet secretary, except as expressly delegated by the president himself. 3, a cabinet secretary should not be encouraged to anticipate either free access or frequent consultation with the president. Cabinet meetings will be rare, and if you would not sign that, you could not be in the cabinet. The book, I ended the book to Michiko Kakutani's disappointment on April 29th of 1973, the day that John Dean was fired and Haldeman and Ehrlichman were let go. And I did that because that was when the presidency, for all practical purposes, ended. He called Haldeman and Ehrlichman down to Camp David and said, I have to let you go, but you must remember you did the right thing. That's what I had to think and tell myself when I was killing innocent children in Hanoi. I was doing the right thing, killing them. He said that then, now I lay me down to sleep, that he prayed each night and hoped he would not wake in the morning. And he began to cry. And he said, this is like cutting off my arms. And you and Bob, you need money. I have some. Bibi has it, Bibi Reboso, and you can have it. Ziegler came into the lodge after Ehrlichman left. The lights were off. The president often worked in the dark. The lights were off, and the president stood framed in the window looking out over the mountains. And he was surprised when Ziegler came up behind him, and he turned and he said, it's all over, Ron. You know that, don't you? An hour later, Ray Price came in with the final drafts of the statement about letting go the administration, and he thought that Nixon looked ravaged. He was shocked and saw Ziegler cry. The president was crying, Ziegler was crying, and Ziegler was obviously relieved to see him come in. And the president said, maybe I should resign, Ray. If you think so, put it in. Just put it in the speech if you think I should quit. And then Nixon walked outside past the swimming pool he had put in and into the woods, and Price stayed a few steps behind because he thought the President of the United States was going to kill himself. It wasn't all like that, but it was a lot like that. And on occasion, there was great humor, usually unintentional, in the White House. Nixon, who, as time went on, avoided meeting more and more people, gave his first formal dinner, state dinner, for Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, 3 months into the administration. And after it was over, he told Haldeman, we've got to do something about these dinners. They go on too long and I have to talk to too many people. And he said, let's cut the soup course. Haldeman, the next morning, was walking toward the kitchen to tell them, we're not going to have a soup course in these. And he bumped into the president's valet, a man named Manolo Sanchez, and he said, Manolo, you know, something happened at the dinner last night that upset the president about what? Manolo says, yeah, he spilled soup all over his vest. Haldeman turned around figuring he could turn him out of this, and he went back in to see the president and said, you know, the Manolo told me about you spilling some soup. And the president said, don't start, Bob. I want you to remember something. Real men don't eat soup. That was our boy, and that's where I spent